Good morning and a very warm welcome to the latest edition of On the Spot with Shiv. First of the Fireside chats at the Virtual Livelihoods India Summit hosted by Axis and co-hosted by Niti Aayog. The Fireside chat will cover the role of state and markets in raising farmer incomes and in expanding the agri sector. It will look at the efficacy of different instruments besides the role that corporates can play in making our agri markets work. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest at this Fireside chat, Dr. Saurabh Garg. Dr. Garg is presently Principal Secretary, Agriculture and Farmers Empowerment, Government of Orissa, where he has worked on digitalizing agriculture and developing a direct transfer scheme for farmers. Prior to this, he was Joint Secretary at the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, where he was responsible for facilitating foreign investment into India and negotiations on investment agreements. Dr. Garg has over 30 years of experience at different levels of the government, district, state, and the central government, as well as in the private sector. The session is hosted by Mr. S. Sivakumar, who is the Group Head of Agri and IT Businesses at ITC Limited. He is also a member of its Corporate Management Committee and oversees the company's social investments. With this, I hand over to Shiv to take forward this discussion. It's over to you, Shiv, now.
Thank you, Pooja, and welcome to the session, Dr. Garg. And good afternoon, all the participants, and welcome to the session. At the outset, let me thank the Axis Livelihoods and Vipin in particular for the opportunity and also institutionalizing this session as on the spot with Shiv. This is the third edition in this format. And it's a great pleasure to host Dr. Saurabh Garg on this theme of making agri-market reforms work. So before I get into the conversation with Dr. Garg, let me take a few minutes to set the context and why I believe this is topical at this point of time. Markets, of course, were always relevant in agriculture, but they are even more important today than ever before. In the soil report that was launched this morning and also in the subsequent session, three different challenges in the agriculture sector got highlighted. First is that while agriculture is the largest source of livelihoods, the challenge is that the incomes are quite low for large majority of the farmers. So much so that 2/3 of the farmers are pretty much indebted because their incomes are less than the bare minimum expenditure to just survive. So that challenge of how do we deal with the low farmer incomes, although agriculture has, relatively speaking, prospered over the several decades in the So I'm sorry the connection had dropped in between. And I think once the conversation starts, if my line drops very similarly, I'm sure Dr. Garg will continue the conversation, and I'll drop like I did just now in a minute or so.
Sure.
So the second challenge I was talking about was despite resource intensive usage, the productivity is low in agriculture, leading to low GDP. And the third challenge that was also discussed at length in both the sessions earlier was about that these things, the incomes and the livelihoods come under further stress because of the rapid depletion of natural resources, whether it is water or topsoil, as also the further accentuated by the climate change in terms of excess rainfall or extended droughts and so on. So I think idea is that in the backdrop of these challenges, there is an important role that markets would play in addition to whatever role that the government has been playing and leading so far in getting the agriculture sector to grow. And why do I say that markets have an important role to play? Because there is a fundamental shift in the profile of consumer demand. A sizable segment of Indian consumers, more than a third broadly, are looking for larger variety of food in what they're consuming, going beyond the cereals into milk, fruits, vegetables, meat, and a whole range of food, and better quality in food, as also concerns of food safety requiring traceability, and also convenience in the way the food is bought and consumed. And these consumers segments, which is sizable, are also willing to pay a premium for these kinds of demands that they are placing on the agricultural produce. So that means that's an opportunity to bring more value and plow it back to the farmers as a way to raise the incomes. And the second bit is on the opportunity for exports. India's share of the global market is only about 2.5% in the agri and food market. And that shows a lot of headroom exists. And it's also an imperative because we are largely a balanced economy in terms of our agricultural and food produce. If we raise productivity and produce more, it will add further stress on the prices unless we are able to export. And obviously, if you have to export, we need to be competitive. Otherwise, it will mean a huge subsidy burden. And only 7% of all our production is exported. So therefore, there is an opportunity there. Only 15% of all our exports are processed or value added in some form. And that shows the value addition opportunity there also. So in addition to changing domestic profile, there is also an opportunity in the export as well. So these two would mean that the production needs to be far more demand responsive than what we have been hitherto. Because some of these are perishable products, the linkages need to be far more dynamic and real time so that the wastages are low and we don't have huge surplus, which is also leading to lower prices. So I think many angles from which the market linkages need to be far better. So what I would call, which is what also is said in Vijay's opening session while summarizing the soil report, is that all of this would mean there is a need for a fundamental transformation in our agricultural and food system from what was largely a production-driven supply chain to a lot more demand-responsive value chain. And if the earlier system was primarily led by government, the newer market-linked system needs to be anchored by market-oriented or a consumer-oriented players. It could be private sector, it could be farmers-owned cooperatives, it could be not-for-profit. And of course, all of this would also mean a significant role that the government has to play in making all of this happen. So that is the context. And of course, naturally, when we are talking about markets, this would mean we are only talking about farmers who have marketable surplus. A significant majority of Indian farmers are subsistence farmers with a limited or no marketable surplus. And on that, of course, there is enormous amount of role that the government or not-for-profit or civil society or the CSR of corporates will play. So for now, we are keeping that aside and focus on those farmers who have marketable surplus in the context. So in that backdrop, my conversation with Dr. Garg will explore the what and how aspects of making all of these feasible in realizing all the three dimensions of raising farmer incomes while growing agriculture, making agriculture more productive, and also make us more resilient for the natural resource and climate change issues. So with that said, welcome again, Dr. Garg, to this conversation. So maybe just to set the ball rolling, let me pose a question in terms of your own thoughts on the role of state and the role of markets in raising farmer incomes and in expanding the agri sector. And then we'll build on that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shivakumar. I think you gave a wonderful exposition of the challenges faced by agriculture and the way forward. If I can just add a couple of things just to bring the context. When we were discussing the incomes and the fact that consumer preferences are changing, if you just look at the last 15 years, how the income of farmers has changed. In the early 2000s, nearly 50% of the income of farmers came from cultivation or cultivation of crops. And as per this data available of 2015, 16, 17, that proportion has come down to 35%. And largely the increase or the change has been from the income that is generated through livestock, which was nearly 2%, which has grown to 15 to 20% depending on the states. And I think that also reflects the kind of consumer preferences, as you mentioned, that the demand for non-cereal crops has increased. And I think that's where the future lies, that how we can diversify the farmers' incomes and farmers what they're producing to which is more demand responsive. And related to that, I think is the question that you asked on the role of the state and the markets. The role of the state would be there obviously in some areas and where public investment is required, where R&D, for example, genetic material development, seeds, etc. But I think in many areas, the role of the state would have to be more facilitating to develop, allow the private sector or public-private partnerships to develop. And that's much more, for example, if I can give examples, would be on agri infrastructure, whether it's cold chains, processing, laboratories. I think there would need to be some kind of enabling framework which the state can develop, but the running of these operations, running maintenance and actual operations have to be with the private sector. They are much better at that. And I think the way I think we took about maybe 10 to 15 years, now we have a good PPP kind of partnerships, and the road structure, if you look at whether it is the EPC and BOT, I think we need to develop certain similar structures in agriculture infrastructure also, which would then facilitate marketing to a much better level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great point in terms of how does one look at state and the markets. While I said is multi-purpose market orientation, but if you are looking at private sector here, how do you get the partnerships as an and going? A great interesting way, not only in roads but closer home in agriculture, was what was initially launched as the public-private partnership for integrated agriculture development 7-8 years ago, and different states have fine-tuned it in different ways to co-opt. But among the leading flagship project that we have been implementing, that I in fact talk about in many places, is in some sense a convergence of investments. The government has existing schemes, and private sector is interested in value chain development for furthering their own business. I mean, how do you integrate these in a manner that it also leads to inclusive value chain development that leads to higher farmer incomes and more competitive value chains? That the government focuses the investments on farmer capacity building, common facilities for the farmers, as well as the shared public infrastructure. But in those geographies and value chains where private sector or the other players come in and commit the value chain development, saying that this is how the value chain development will occur and this is how the institutional structure will be formed in the form of FPOs or whatever, and plow back the incomes to the farmers. And if that's where the investments are converged, then the multiplier impact is a lot more. So I think that is an important area.
Yeah, if I can just take, for example, there's this new program called the Agriculture Infrastructure Fund, which precisely does an interest subvention for the private sector. And I think that's a very important contribution. And similar is there on the animal husbandry and the fisheries side also, where the kind of agriculture infrastructure requirements are extremely high. So it's, I won't call it a really, in terms of gap funding, the viability gap funding, but the interest subvention is already there. And many states are doing a top-up to this of a capital investment. In Orissa, for example, we do that, and we've merged our funding with the Agriculture Infrastructure Fund. So, and the other is on information dissemination. I think that's where a number of programs and activities have been done. In Orissa, I can just give one example, but I'm sure everywhere there are. And Government of India also has this program in conjunction with IFCO on disseminating advisories, so that we reduce the risk of the farmers. And I think that's where ultimately we are going towards, and that's where the markets can help us to look at. One is obviously the production risk, but the other is the market risk. And information dissemination on weather, for example, is a big input into reducing these kind of risks. There are other methods of reducing the production and the market risks, but information and the use of technology to disseminate that information are increasingly being used. For example, in remote sensing, in crop insurance, we are doing that every 15 days you get the inputs of the photographs of the ground level. And while the technology has not yet reached to that level that we can go to the grain itself, but it does give a fair idea of the condition of the crop, and wherever the conditions of crop are less, it can be done by a ground truthing.
Yeah, absolutely valid. Information and knowledge as important sources for risk reduction. So implicit in the way you described the role of state and the markets and in some form the facilitatory and partnership role is obviously a level of variation across different crops or regions. In some, the role of state would possibly a lot more than other. In some, the role of markets would be a lot more than others, whether you look at it from a regional angle or from the crops angle or from the profile of farmers angle. So would you like to build on this and say in terms of are there more skewed kind of things which would work? That okay, in this area, I think markets have limited role to play, or in this area, I think relatively markets will have to play a bigger role.
Yeah. No, absolutely. If you look at, there are various ways of slicing this issue, but let's look at first is in terms of the kind of crop or what we're doing. So you have cereal crops or those which I can put as non-perishable, and then you have the whole basket of fruits, vegetables, which are perishable. So the role of the private sector would naturally be much higher in the in the perishable category, because they need to be much closer to the markets and much closer to the consumer. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at the role of the state and the markets would be on looking at, if you look at production risk as one area where there needs to be interventions either by the market or the state. And one of the main areas for production risk would be better genetic material. So the kind of R&D for seeds, planting, material, etc., would tend to be where public investment is there, where you need much more patient capital, where it may not be possible to get in the early stages have too much private capital. Though once we mature, as in the US and American markets, a lot of the seed companies, etc., all in the private sector. But I think at this stage, and that's what the ICAR is focusing on these kind of issues. The other area in production risk would be on water availability and on irrigation, which is again in the foreseeable future going to continue with the government funding a lot of the irrigation, maybe small irrigation or large irrigation, the focus obviously being on small irrigation. And on information, I already mentioned, so that would also help to reduce the production risk. The second is on the market risks, part of the pricing risk. And that's where I think the role of the markets, the role of the private sector is continue to be high. And perhaps on that area, the role of the state would maybe get restricted at the vulnerable farmers, maybe the small and marginal farmers, on what can be done by the state to ensure that the incomes of the vulnerable farmers don't move too much with the market vagaries. And there are various kinds of graded support possible, telescopic, depending on the area of the farmers. But that's where, for example, on the processing side, on the cold chains, sorting, grading, where the private sector's knowledge, the domain expertise is required, with some amount of support or facilitation, either on the policy level or perhaps on the financial side of the government.
Okay. So if you have to delayer this a little bit in the angle of role of state, wherever it is more pertinent, into, let's say, the center at a state level, yeah. As also, in some sense, if you have to bring in the Gram Panchayats and local self-government in some sense, as not exactly government, but also government, you are, of course, much better place to bring that layer in. So in which way do we look at all these three and other layers also, dealing in a different way to those areas where the state has to play a significant role?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think whether it's the central government, the state government, or I would say the district or the sub-district levels of governance, Panchayati Raj institutions, etc. So in the current structure also, I think the central government plays a lot more focus on the agricultural research aspects, which I think are best done at a more collective level, so to say. And where the government of India is also playing a large role in terms of getting together the best practices that exist and developing programs so that each state can have individually tailored programs. I think the RKVY is a prime example of that concept of the government of India providing broad framework and then each state implementing. Implementation, no doubt, is a largely ambit within the ambit of the state governments in terms of actually having the field personnel on the ground who interact with the farmers and doing and at the ground level ensuring that the inputs are available and marketing facilities are made available. At the district and sub-district level, it's where a lot of the local level infrastructure, whether you call them Grameen Haats, you call them market yards, you have the local facilitating systems in terms of sorting, grading, and having the input availability, ensure the logistics facilitation that is ensured. So I think these are the areas where these three levels are working on, and increasingly at the panchayats level, the infrastructure development, that's an important area which is being looked upon to look at as we go ahead. But I think looking at it at a much research level, I think one or two things we need to keep in view, that we had a major technological inputs in the 1960s and 70s with the Green Revolution, and which allowed the rice and wheat systems to expand. So I suppose just like every technology, every product has a life cycle, the time has come, and it has in the last decade or two, the focus is increasing on other crops and other perishables on fruits and vegetables and livestock and fisheries. And that's where I think in future also the growth will be, and that's where that's the trend that is also in the farmers' income, if you see.
Okay. So while we are on this aspect of green revolution and rice and wheat, that obviously brings to an important policy instrument, besides of course research and extension and all that other aspects, is the whole aspect of MSP. MSP obviously played a crucial role in expanding the rice and wheat production and make us self-sufficient, and more recently a more prominent role in pulses production expansion, and potentially now in oil seeds. But MSP as an instrument, obviously when it is linked only to cost, that it needs to be cost plus, I mean, that is the design, then there is an assured purchase, I mean, albeit a purchase doesn't necessarily happen all over the country across all the 23 crops for which MSP is there. But MSP, if we have to talk about diversification, like you mentioned, in terms of fruits and vegetables and fisheries and other things, is also an important hurdle along the way, that there is an assured profitability in certain crops. The demand is for some other crops where the price volatility is even more, market linkage are not established. So how does one navigate through this situation, and is there something that you are attempting yourself within Odisha? Of course, the rice and wheat were not the way in the Green Revolution there in Odisha, but nonetheless, the shift is something which is important. But how do we navigate through this important hurdle?
I would look at this as, how do we incentivize cropping in a area where we feel that there is a greater demand. For example, until maybe a few years back, we were importing pulses, but now pulses is more or less, we are growing all our demand of our pulses, and maybe we're exporting in limited quantities. The other area where we still have a lot more to do is on the oil seeds, on oil. We're still importing oil to a certain extent, and wherever comparative advantages allow us, we should focus on oil seeds. So incentivizing crops is an area that, for example, even in Odisha, we are incentivizing for non-paddy in the upland and the medium lands. In the lowlands, paddy is the preferred crop, and there's no point trying to incentivize growing of other crops. But in those lands and in those agroecologies where other crops can be grown, and especially fruits and vegetables, that's what we are incentivizing through different production incentives, and also by forming farmer production clusters, producer groups, and then elevating them or consolidating them into farmer producer companies, or FPOs as we call them. So I think the incentivization structure would need to evolve as we move forward. And while MSP should continue, no doubt, in terms of looking at the vulnerable farmer, so that the small farmer, the marginal farmer, a farmer who does not have access to or inability to access technology, inability to access higher skills, should have that minimum basic income available. So I suppose over time this would need to evolve, keeping in view the vulnerabilities of the farmer and what is the support. But similarly would be the incentivization that we can do for the desired crops, if I can put it that way, and also having greater infrastructure support in the perishable areas.
So if you have to look at these two instruments, one is the income support through schemes that, for example, what you pioneered as Kalia, subsequently as PM Kisan, and some of these vis-a-vis MSP. While there is a strategic role of MSP in certain crops and in food security and some of these areas, is the income support scheme less market distorting and consequently more helpful both from a farmer's income perspective as well as in getting the crops to be more demand responsive, as opposed to a centralized decision on an MSP, to decentralized decision by the farmer in terms of what can be grown. What will be the relative pros and cons of these two instruments, and how can one leverage them to move towards the direction that we desire?
The income support scheme, whether it's PM Kisan, Kalia, Raitu Bandhu, or no doubt provide a certain minimum assurance to the farmer and the confidence that even if the crop fails, they have this minimum support that they have got. But we need to also recognize the limitations of direct income support. If the objective is, for example, for them to purchase certain seeds or fertilizers, pesticides, the farmer would take an informed decision on that. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that it's not necessary that the entire income support would be spent on agricultural purposes. It would no doubt look at what the family needs are, and whatever is the most urgent and critical or important activity, that is what would obviously take precedence. And I don't think we should be too worried on that aspect, because the objective is anyway to provide a basic minimum support to the farmers. The MSP, on the other hand, I think a lot of economists and a lot of research has mentioned, as you mentioned, it is market distorting. But the fact remains that the very nature of MSP, or the fact that the MSP exists, that itself helps to ensure that market prices are not extremely fluctuating, which might impact farmers very, very adversely. I think the price support scheme, which has been started over the past couple of years, has a ceiling of somewhere around 25% of the total produce is what is can be bought under the private price support scheme to support the farmers. And I think that sends the right signal to both the farmers and the markets that the government is there in case there's going to be, to prevent any farmer distress. And I think that kind of approach would be required even in a future as we go ahead. How that exact percentages would work and how it would be focused if on vulnerable farmers, those are matters of detail. But the fact remains that it's not that the MSP can be done away with if the income support programs are there, but it gives us the flexibility to look at what kind of farmers would need the income support, and therefore what is the kind of support or what kind of variations that we can think of in the implementation of the MSP going forward.
So one of the pluses of an MSP, which is talked about, is that it doesn't matter if you are a landowning farmer or a tenant farmer, the benefits will come so long as you are growing and producing a marketable surplus. Whereas income support for large part is linked to land ownership. Of course, Kalia had also take it to landless and others. So how does one structure these income support schemes to ensure that the more balanced access is also there for all types of farmers? Is there any experience that you bring, and if you are to now using that experience recast the program, what changes would you make?
As you correctly mentioned, in Kalia, we included all farmers, including landless. But if I can just add a point in out here, our research showed that tenant farmers or sharecroppers, depends on, or farmers who lease land from other farmers. It might be an oral lease in the absence of written lease. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers, or oral lease land farmers are typically not landless. They are small farmers or marginal farmers having half an acre, 1 acre, and I would call them their aspirational farmers, because they would like to have more land. If they're not unable to own it, they lease it in and cultivate it. So given that our scheme, we had kept it open for all farmers, and which is also the case for PM Kisan, it's open to all land-owning farmers, irrespective of the ownership. It might be half an acre or 1/4 of an acre, but the amount remains the same. So to that extent, it's agnostic to the amount of land that the farmer owns. As long as the farmer owns, the farmer gets, and that takes care, I would say, more than 90% of the cases of tenant farmers, sharecroppers. The real problem comes in more in the terms of landless agricultural laborers, some of whom might be termed as landless farmers, but they are landless agricultural laborers who are working in other farmers' fields, and in some cases might be leasing in. I think one of the approaches that we used in Kalia was to look at how we can build their skills so that they can move up the chain from being a wage earner to become, to some extent, a self-employed person. But the kind of risk levels that are required for a self-employed person are much more than what is for a wage earner. So until we look at the skill levels of the landless and look at upgrading their wealth or the investment that we can give in, an income support would be more in the terms of Manrega, which provides the wage labor or assured wage labor across seasons. So I think the kind of focus or the kind of scheme we'll have to have for a landless agricultural laborer needs to be different from the income support that we can give to a small farmer.
Okay, so I think it's important that we are able to balance the interests of all of these segments. So let's switch gears a little bit and look at your thoughts on the role of agri-tech startups. We talked about the importance of market linkages, especially for perishables. Technology plays a crucial role, and wonderful initiatives by a number of startups on that front. Then there are many on precision farming. You already talked about access to information leading to change in farm practices, whether it is to do with improving the irrigation efficiency or application of nutrition and so on, or rapid quality testing and so on. So there are many different areas. So one is what kind of a role do you see in the scheme of things that we talked about? And in that context, what is it that government can do to provide a flip and ensure that the potential from these agri-tech startups is really realized?
I think a lot of these agri-startups are also leveraging technology. And I think that's where their comparative advantage comes in from existing businesses that are there. And technology can be, as I mentioned earlier, on remote sensing is one technology which a lot of them are using and leveraging that. The other is obviously information dissemination through mobiles, which I mentioned, and a lot of them are focused on this. You also have, in terms of linking markets, whether it's an ENAM kind of a platform that is there, or developing similar such platforms so that traders and farmers can get linked. But I think one area where technology, agri startups will really make a big impact is in the availability of credit for landless agriculture and small farmers. We are doing a program, for example, with some NBFCs on how they can lend to landless farmers without collateral. And technology is being used for that. And as I mentioned, that nowadays you have from the satellites, every 15 days you can get photographs of the condition of the crop. They can also give information on what has been the input applications, whether a fertilizer has been applied or whether there's some kind of a pest attack which is changing. So this kind of monitoring by the credit giving lender, the NBFC, is helping us to provide credit to those who previously were not accessing formal credit. And as you're aware, in the agriculture side, there is still a large proportion of people who are unable to get formal lending support from the traditional banking system. And that's where there are a number of organizations, NGOs, agri startups who are working with the farmers on this. So I think the agri startups will help fill in these niche roles. On markets, we are working, for example, with a farmer producer company who is now able to use the fact that because of DBT, because of bank accounts, the transfer of money can be so fast, and looking at how warehousing receipts can be more effectively utilized. So I think agri startups will continue to play a big role in leveraging technology for the benefit of farmers, and I think that promises a lot of good bindings for farmers in general.
So taking that angle of, you talked about the farmer producer company, and obviously FPC or collectives in any form and FPOs. If there is one institutional mechanism that can create a pull for many of these services and also make it more efficient for the startups or other agri companies to reach the farmers as a way that will then create a more virtuous kind of a cycle here of services available, leveraging technology and otherwise from one side, and FPO as a mechanism for creating the pull. What kind of, while we have these new guidelines for setting up another 10,000 FPOs, and many of the earlier challenges were dealt with in these guidelines in terms of market linkages and so on. But what role can the state government play in strengthening FPOs, building on the guidelines that the center had released? Or is there something that Odisha is already doing that we can take some lessons from on how do you create a vibrant FPO ecosystem in all this new environment?
Yeah. No, I mean, the new, as you mentioned, the new FPO guidelines have taken a lot of the inputs, and we are actively implementing those guidelines. What we are also doing apart from that is building a cadre of, what if I can put it, agri entrepreneurs. So what our vision is that we have 7,000 panchayats in Odisha. In each panchayat, we should be able to promote at least one agri entrepreneur who would be able to not only help in providing input services to the farmer producer organizations, collectives in terms of the fertilizers, pesticides, seeds, etc., but also act as the bridge to marketing in terms of linking the farmers, producers' products with the markets. So for that, we have this agriculture production cluster program where we are doing what, if I can call, synchronized production. So that let's say a tomato or any other vegetable, cauliflower, takes two months to from the seed to the final product. So if there are a group of 50 farmers, 10 farmers will sow cauliflower on day 1, another 10 will sow it on day 10, another 10 on day 20, so that the production that comes out is continuous rather than all being bunched up at one level. And this for a perishable product is extremely important. And that's where a collective is required, so that the farmer has that faith that if I'm part of this collective, it's not that if I don't sow it today, but I sow it 20 days later, it's not that my product will not get sold or it will not happen. So these are the kind of micro level decision making which we can do with the help of these producer groups, which are aggregated into farmer producer companies, and then build the supply chain. One of the main problems which we have noticed, a lot of the whether it's big bar, any of the big retail chains that are there, they need assurance of a constant supply, so that if they need every week, they need 5 trucks of XYZ, it will be available for 2 months or 10 weeks during the season. And that is the kind of assurance that we are trying to build through these producer groups, through this synchronized cultivation, and also ensuring that at one place, that particular FPO does one kind of vegetable rather than each farmer doing 10 kinds of vegetables, and maybe another FPO adjacent to do it can do. And just giving the example of vegetables because that's the easiest in terms of perishables. But this is the kind of activity that we can do once the farmers are together as a collective. Though they will be cultivating individually, but there will be support in terms of providing them technical support so that the quality of the product is similar, and the buyer gets an assured supply of that product for whatever time the season or the agroecological conditions in that area permit. And there are very small interventions that we've done. For example, there are enough studies which show that if, again, I'm using example of perishable like vegetable, that whether the vegetable is transported in gunny sacks or whether it is transported in plastic crates will lead to a 10 to 20% difference in the price of that vegetable. So these kind of initiatives ensuring that this is available at the micro level, and it becomes easier to get these inputs or get these or get this training of farmers, so to say, done it through the FPOs, and that's where the agri entrepreneur is helping us. And we hope in the next 3 to 5 years there would be a change. And I think that's the kind of approach that other states and the government of India also has for this sector.
Right. So certainly collectives in any of these formats will help empower in addition to improving the operations efficiency. But there is the continuous expressed concern that in these market linkages, whatever be the nature of market players, corporates, and any other form of private sector, all of this would mean an exploitative relationship and could potentially be a stronger partner in this relationship. So collective obviously will deal with one, but we are seeing the necessity of these market linkages through private sector on one hand for perishables in particular, and the concerns on the relative bargaining power on the other side. So in addition to these FPO as one method to empower, are there other things that either government could do, our industry itself could do, or anything else that comes to your mind that to deal with this major big elephant in the room, that in order to take these market forces forward, what do we do?
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. I think the role of the state in if I can put it, in helping ensure that the contractual terms are even-handed is no doubt recognized. And one is obviously in terms of education, awareness, and of the farmers and building them as collectives. But more importantly would also be in terms of how that enforcement of those contracts is done and what is possible at the ground level. At the same time, and on the corporate side also, I think there are associations of federations of the industries which need also to be roped in to ensure that ethical behavior and corporate responsibilities which each corporate has needs to be enforced at every opportunity. But contract enforcement and the role of the state in ensuring that unequal contracts don't get entered into, I think in the initial stages, the role of the states and the district and the sub-district levels would be much higher. And I think that's an area that we would need to learn as we move ahead. But I don't think that we need to assume that every such relationship has to be exploitative. I think there are enough ethical companies and corporations that exist, and that farmers are smart enough and they have the necessary availability of information. Where we need to focus on is obviously on the vulnerable farmers, and that's where a much higher role of handholding would be there. For example, we've associated in each of our programs where we have market linkages, we use a local NGO as the handholding institution to help us. And that NGO works with the department staff and acts as the bridge between the community farmers and the government staff. And given that these local NGOs are community-based, they have deeper linkages, and they are, in our view, they are proving to be very, very useful. I think the FPO policy also has the CBCs and all those institutions, which are these kind of organizations. And I think once these kind of organizations are much more active, they will help to ensure that farmers don't willy-nilly enter into any contracts which can be self-defeating.
Yeah. So do you also see the role of these NGOs in potential dispute resolution? Because that's been one area of concern. You did refer that, yeah, how do we participate and ensure that disputes get resolved if there are in swifter and inexpensive manner? So do you see the role of NGOs or any other mechanism that you think is more relevant?
Yeah, I think if I can put it at a broader level, contract enforcement, one of the major areas of where we need to, as a country, move ahead is, if you look at the ease of doing business indicators, the indicator that we are doing the worst is in terms of contract enforcement. So one is obviously at a broader level of contract enforcement, the strengthening that we need to do of the various systems. But at the ground level, at least the NGOs and the CBOs would be able to, if not directly participate, but at least help maybe in the mediation part, maybe in terms of the awareness part, in terms of bringing it to the notice of the relevant enforcement authorities on the issues. And I think that's where going forward, we would need to look at what roles they can play. But I think this is an area that, as we move forward in the implementation of a lot of these programs, policies, this is an area where we will need to evolve going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty critical. I mean, of course, there is like you also said, not all relationships and contracts need to be a zero-sum game resulting in exploitative kind of thing, because there is many where the dependency is reciprocal. We have seen for a long time businesses in seed production, in organic farming, any specialty crop for that matter, that the buyer relies on the farmer for a sustained business, and the farmer relies on the buyers for improved profitability. And it's not therefore a zero-sum game that if I pay less, that's I get more profit, and vice versa from a farmer's perspective. That's when the disputes do come in. So one is there are certain kind of opportunities where the dependency can be reciprocal when the question of disputes won't even arise. And but where there are, obviously all these mechanisms then need to play a role. Even in the general crops, derivative markets in terms of options which can be integrated into contract pricing. It is one of the ways in which the equivalent of MSP can be integrated into contracts. But derivative markets obviously need to evolve, and which is another mechanism where it doesn't become a zero-sum game, but can become mutually advantageous. I think some of that is key.
We would no doubt need the expertise of people like you to ensure and develop this area. But as you mentioned, this is a critical area, and this will also is a critical area to ensure that the trust is built up between the farmers and the market players. And how we can continue to build this trust is an area I think going forward we would need to focus much more.
So great. So one of the other things you were talking about in the earlier conversation was on credit flow. And there is a question which has come up here, which is saying that distortion of credit markets hinder credit flow. Is it possible to shift subsidies on loans, and if possible waivers, to post-harvest interventions and ensure that all farmers benefit, not just borrowers? So is there a way in which the credit subsidies shift more to post-harvest interventions?
I don't know whether the credit subsidies in a way are crowding out the subsidies on the post-harvest areas. The credit subsidies, I think I would look at it more in terms of how to ensure that credit is available for all, and how cheaper credit is available for all, rather than looking at it as how we can shift it to. And given that we need that financial inclusion is a major policy framework. You had the Jan Dhan accounts, and the focus is on ensuring that how the formal system would reach the unbanked or the untouched consumer. I think that's an area that we need to give much more greater focus, and by using NBFCs and correspondent banks, and how we can expand and rework and develop that correspondent banking system to ensure that credit is available to all. I think there's also a larger problem or larger issue that we as a society are not very keen to take on credit. So that's a much larger issue. I'm not getting to that. But the fact remains that even if we want to take credit, we are not able to get credit. So I would look at it that as one. And the second part on post-harvest investments, no doubt we need to increase those post-harvest investments. And there, as I mentioned, that the state, if it is facilitative, corporate sector would be able to invest so much more rather than the government trying to invest on their own. So if, as a combination of what can be done on credit and financial inclusion, and what can be done to facilitate private investments at the post-harvest, for post-harvest, a combination of this would to an extent be fiscal balancing and not be fiscally too onerous. So I think that's the back of the mind the questioner might have had the question about.
Right. Okay, so we pretty much have come to the end of our conversation. We have covered a lot of ground, and I would leave you a couple of minutes to make some closing remarks, integrating all of this what does it really take to make the markets work, to ensure we deal with all the three challenges of raising farmers' income, the larger agricultural growth, as well as more sustainable environment, more resilient. So from all these three angles, any closing remarks?
I think I would just say that we've moved much forward from what was our concern over the past few decades, which was food security, because that was the initial concern of, if you discuss with a lot of senior agricultural experts, that's the area that has been. Going forward, I think we need to shift to nutrition security. It's ensuring that, I don't think food security, I'm not saying that it's not an issue on the table, or we need to be cognizant of it, that it can happen, but we need to now look at what is required for nutritional security. And that's where the issue of crop diversification, that's where the issue of consumer preferences, that's where the issue of, given the socioeconomic status has improved, so everyone is looking at these issues of nutritional security. And that's where the market's playing a much greater role than what they had played in the past in an economy of scarcities. So I think given this change that has occurred broadly at the macroeconomic level and also in the agriculture sector, I think the challenges accordingly flow from there. And that's the focus, I would say that we would need to look at. And therefore, there would necessitate certain changes to be made in the existing frameworks that are already in place.
That's wonderful, Dr. Garg. Thank you for the various insightful comments and the breadth of the perspective that you brought in. I think the key takeaway that I would like to summarize is one of partnerships that you really started with. To make markets work, it's more of partnerships that would enable all of that, whether it is the state facilitating a few things and the ecosystem of farmers collectives, FPOs being an important mechanism in that to empower the farmers, and very importantly the role that you brought of NGOs who would facilitate all of these partnerships, and the various institutions that government would facilitate, and recognizing the role of the private sector and in particular agri-tech startups. I think the partnerships is potentially what can help in dealing with the challenges that we had outlined. Thank you very much for a great conversation.
Thank you. I enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you.
Back to you, Pooja.
Thank you, Dr. Garg and Mr. Shivakumar, for this very insightful discussion covering the whole gamut of issues in making markets work for the farmers, the various policy instruments available, and the role of different actors in it. Thank you, Mr. Shivakumar, for bringing out the best from this conversation. And we'll take a short break now and be back with our thematic parallel sessions at 2. So we have the FPO track in Hall A, we have the CSR track in Hall B, and we have the Women's Economic Empowerment track in Hall C. So look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.